William H. Chapey, Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, a Lillian Smith Book Award for this expose of how our society can have its foundations sapped and weakened to such a significant condition that we realized she has broken silence on an amazing situation that was so well planned and executed. Dr. MacLean has shown us how threatened our hopes and gains for the condition of social justice as well as civil and human rights in this country are. These are standards of worth that Lillian Smith treasured and worked for in a South that was dangerous in her time and that we hope to carry on. This book shows a deeply entrenched plan beginning with the academic theorization to circumvent the established workings of democracy as we have known it. James M. Buchanan, a Nobel Prize winner, seized upon some public positions of John C. Calhoun, states and minority rights advocate, and did not look back. His plan in time, funded by the Koch brothers, included well-planned seminars for legislators, lawyers, teachers, and Washington personnel, among others, a well-founded program for doctoral degrees, which were all part of the scheme to lay down a foundation centered around Buchanan's determination to undermine the governmental system as it was and build up a new society of makers and takers to benefit the haves and more or less enslave the have-nots. The hair-raising part of this whole story, as it was unfolded through careful research, was the terrible sense that it is all happening in Washington, D.C. now. While we have been utterly distracted by the antics of the White House, according to Dr. MacLean in her interview with Bill Maher, 28 states have decided in favor of a constitutional convention, which political powers have long declared too complicated and risky. The rise of this undermining of the structure of our tripartite government is a daunting prospect and a grim reality. The Liberty Amendments lists and I have trouble with the plural thing, and expatiates on at least 11 proposed changes, amendments. And as late as the 1950s, southern states tried to nullify and interpose themselves to prevent school integration. For her unrelenting research and revelations of the forces which have been at work, we are proud to award one of the Lillian Smith Book Prizes to Dr. Nancy MacLean for her scholarship in these urgent issues.
So very much, Dr. Twiningbear, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the other judges and to Gene Cleveland and the Southern Regional Council, and also thank you to my friend and co-prize winner, James Forward, whose work is just must-reading for our times. This is also a moving event for me, and also almost a kind of homecoming. And I'll just mention 3 connections that occurred to me as I was thinking about coming back to Atlanta. When I first began to study Southern history in the 1980s and to engage in primary source research on the early 20th century South, one of the historical actors whose work I found most illuminating was Charles S. Johnson, the first, the great sociologist and the editor of Opportunity. I was reading his work for my dissertation on the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s in Georgia, after discovering a cache of internal Klan records. As you might imagine, these are quite rare, but a cache of untouched Klan records at the University of Georgia's Special Collections Library, which is now home to the Lillian Smith Prize. And my particular project in that dissertation on the Ku Klux Klan was the puzzle that I was trying to solve involved the Klan's exploitation of what we today would call family values, questions of gender and parental authority, and how these worked with the kind of apocalyptic racism for which the Klan was rightly known. I soon learned that there was no better place to start mining that vein about race and sex and white defenses of the social order than the brilliant writings of Lillian Smith. So, truly, I feel that I am coming home today, and I am so honored to be winning this prize with my friend and fellow Atlantan, James Foreman. And these are just the connections to my first book. To turn to the current one, Democracy in Chains, I'm so honored to have it presented and to have myself introduced by Dr. Twining Baird. Because back in 1980, Dr. Baird co-authored a beautiful article in the Journal of Black Studies with someone who is a hero to many of us in this room, I'm sure, Septima Clark. And that piece actually speaks hauntingly to the story that I tell in Democracy in Chains. The article concerned Mr. Esau Jenkins and the legendary struggle that he led to bring inclusive democracy, to bring democracy, period, one might say, to Johns Island. And it contained these words, and I quote, "The blacks of Johns Island registered to vote. They found out that school boards listen to voters. Sheriffs don't pistol whip voters. Judges don't railroad voters." Maybe that's strange. But officials listen to voters. Voting does count. Voting does indeed count, as Democracy in Chains underscores. And that is why it is under such threat today, in a way we've not seen for decades, and in a manner as calculated and as sweeping as the voter suppression efforts of the late 1890s and 1900s that erected the system that Mr. Jenkins fought. Why is that? Because, I learned in my research, voting by ever more Americans from a more diverse variety of backgrounds over the course of the 20th century, often organized and in collective social movements, brought about many changes that the great majority of Americans value, but that a tiny minority of radical right libertarians oppose. People I've come to think about as property supremacists. These measures include things going back to the Progressive era and forward from there, such as graduated income taxes and consumer protection, such as fair labor standards and minimum wages, such as retirement security from Social Security and Medicare, civil rights and anti-discrimination legislation, federal protection of our air and water, government action on the climate and its changing situation, and of course, public schools and desegregation and more. These I learned through my research, and I really did feel as though I were entering an alternate universe when I began to dig deep into this organized libertarian movement. These developments that I've just described, that are valued by great majorities of Americans, are all anathema to a libertarian cause that was utterly marginal at the time my book starts with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, but somehow between then and now has come to dominate one of our major political parties, and through that political party, 30 of our 50 states, and all three branches of our federal government. And that cause is right now pushing a program of radical transformation that is designed to be permanent, including altering our Constitution. All without being honest with the American people about what the real end game is. But how could a tiny, extreme, ideological minority change a great nation such as this? That's the surprising story that my book tells. In a nutshell, by playing a highly sophisticated, multi-pronged, long game well. My book focuses on two men, a thinker and a CEO. The thinker is James McGill Buchanan, Tennessee-born figure who served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, came to Virginia to teach in the 1950s, and went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. The CEO is Charles Koch, and Before I knew about Charles Koch, though, and I had never heard of James McGill Buchanan, I should say too, so don't feel bad if you haven't. He's not a household name. But I actually picked up this trail following another story, and that was in the late 1950s when, as the new chair of the economics department at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, he abetted the state's program of massive resistance by pushing for the privatization of public education, which was a leading demand of the massive resistors. So, intrigued by why someone who's trained as a free market economist, who described himself as an advocate of the free society, why such a man would be aligning in practice with the demands of the most extreme segregationists was a mystery to me, and I began to follow this individual through archives that ultimately led me to Charles Koch, a man that I believe will be remembered decades from now as far more consequential than Donald Trump, who currently dominates the news coverage as the program of Charles Koch is moving along in federal department and agency after federal department and agency through those 30 states and in the courts. So my book story in a nutshell is of how Charles Koch and the vast network of wealthy donors he's assembled, over 150 now regularly attend these seminars and pledge at least $100,000 a year to this cause, how this network of organizations and infrastructure they've built up, groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Federalist Society, the State Policy Network, the Atlas Network, I could go on, there are quite literally hundreds at this point, how they have weaponized the ideas of James Buchanan over the last 2 decades to transform our country using these ideas to reverse engineer, literally, the public policies of the 20th century. They are doing this too, not really by persuasion. They just put out bromides about liberty and the free society, but they're doing it by radical rules change in those 30 states that they control, including my own North Carolina, with radical voter suppression, radical gerrymandering, undermining the rights of public sector labor unions, prohibiting action on climate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my conclusion can be stated simply. We are facing now an all-hands-on-deck emergency for the future of democracy in this country. And I think that these changes that are intended to be permanent, will either be pushed back or will be implemented within the next few years. I believe the timeline is that short, given how far down the train this track is. We are really talking about, once again, whether government of, by, and for the people will endure. So I want to thank you for the honor of this prize, which will help me and others that I've been working with now, who are working very hard to alert the public to this danger and inform and help people to organize so that we may preserve that precious heritage that we need so much to solve the problems of our time. Thank you.